And if we just change ourselves, we can change dynamics without ever having to tell other people what to do or not to do or create any other kind of activity, but just the peace within ourselves. And I watch this couple with their very peaceful dog, and I know that, of course, how we interact with creatures of all kinds, human and others, how we go, what energy we go into the world with is largely going to make changes without us explicitly having to do that. So I was really quite impressed by the creative and effective ways that these people resolve their conflicts, and particularly that it was the authority and the respect given to the elders which helped people move along through life stage by stage, getting more and more important to their society instead of less and less important, giving everybody the understanding that they would soon arrive at that point, and very critical to giving respect to the elders in a society like that is the elders giving respect to the younger ones. So it had to work both ways. So much of this really changed a lot of what happened in my interactions with my children, and I brought them with me into the field where they saw, having lived both in the United States in a very modern, urbanized context, and then living in Moscow in the Soviet Union, again, an urbanized, modernized approach where the older you get, you get pushed aside. It was wonderful to see them admire how this society worked with this intergenerational respect, and them experiencing the respect that they got from the elders as well. So some of the lessons I learned, I already mentioned. One, the enormous kinds of sacrifices that ordinary people are willing to make for the sake of peace. And also how creating relationships, how creating relatedness with others pretty much prevents bad deeds done to others. Violence being the worst of it, but we certainly know of many other ways humans are abusive to each other, in speech, in action, in withholding communication, as well as in communication. As I also mentioned, by this time I had been divorced. I was a single parent, and I had to look back at the ways I was being in my marriage, and some of the things that I could have done differently had I had lived in this community, had I been brought up with a different way of thinking about conflict resolution. I saw, particularly what I was focusing on at that time, I was doing my dissertation or my master's thesis as an anthropologist in the Moscow University. I was doing it on child rearing in the Abkhaz rural areas, and therefore I stumbled across these councils of elders. I started out my study being very interested in child rearing and also in living long lives. Did I mention that this was part of a study to look at the long-living peoples of this area who lived over the age of 90 in larger percentages than most other territories in the Soviet Union. In Azerbaijan, we also found communities like that, not only in Abkhazia, Georgia, and of course there are in other parts of the world those communities. So I was interested in gerontology and I was interested in child rearing, but these councils of elders, these incredibly poignant ways of getting around conflict, preventing it, but mostly rolling it back and creating peace, took me in a whole different trajectory. And I left behind the child rearing studies, I left behind the gerontology studies, and began really working on conflict resolution and looking at culture and conflict. That is, how people in different cultures fight and how they make up in different cultures. So fast forwarding, I lived for about another 10 or so years in the Soviet Union after these experiences. I came back to the United States in 1989, 1990, pretty discouraged with the Gorbachev reforms. It looked like it was not going to happen, what those of us thought were going to happen, a real rejuvenation of Soviet society and a social democratic, stable society. It was turning into really ugly nationalism and ethnic conflicts, and the vacuum left by a weak central power left open a lot of space for political and ethnic entrepreneurs to do a great deal of damage and spread many stories about each other and the other, such that then it was possible for former neighbors, relatives, to pick up guns and shoot at one another and create havoc. So meanwhile, while my beloved Abkhazia was turning into a war zone, where from 1992 to 1993, in a territory of about 500,000 inhabitants, only 90,000 of them Abkhaz. So you imagine a territory maybe no larger than New Jersey, or maybe not even as large as New Jersey, where within a little over a year, 20 to 30,000 people were dead in urban warfare, in awful fighting on these beautiful shores of the Black Sea. Sometimes when you look at the videos of people in camouflage with rifles, going through this paradise, it just makes you feel as though, humanity has infinite capacities for evil. I resist that thought. I resist that way of thinking, and I resist that story. So I will carry on with the evolution of my own journey. During the war, I found it impossible to relate to the warfare. My father had been a Jewish war refugee from the Civil War of the Soviet Union, and he had seen his parents killed and tortured before killed as a 10 to 12-year-old. He had been quite heavily traumatized in the Civil War of Russia that then became the Soviet Union. And he left as an orphan with his older brother to the United States. So my father, who had experienced such violence at a young age, somehow came out of it a completely nonviolent person and a very soft-hearted, kind man who talked about pacifism not as a complete, way of being for him. He fought in World War II, and he did believe that there were causes that one could fight for. But generally, there was something in my DNA about not being able to either pick up a gun or buy or support people who were fighting. And so my friends and dear friends, Abkhaz, were out there fighting, and I couldn't bring myself to help them with that. All I could manage to do was to have clothing and food sent out there. And I was so relieved in 1994 when the ceasefire became final, and I thought, okay, that's why I had to learn all of this mediation and conflict resolution. This is where I can play a role. And I went back to the region